The ballroom shimmered like a constellation made flesh, each chandelier a star spilling molten light across velvet draperies and polished parquet. Women glided in silken gowns of cerulean, rose, and jade, the whispers of taffeta brushing against the ears of the curious, the ambitious, and the idle. Music, delicate yet insistent, wound through the room in lilting arcs, coaxing feet to sway and hearts to quicken, though not every heart in the hall throbbed with joy. One figure, framed by the gilded doors, stood apart, an island of quiet composure in a sea of calculated charm. Her gown, while simple compared to the jeweled extravagance around her, held the subdued elegance of a woman accustomed to dignity, rather than display. Her eyes, a muted shade of gray, moved like slow lanterns across the crowd, absorbing without inviting, registering every glance that lingered a heartbeat too long, every whisper that sought her name. She was a widow, 40 years of age, and she had learned early that society's adoration was conditional and fickle. Once, she had commanded notice effortlessly, her laughter a jewel among the dull clink of polite conversation. But years of solitude and propriety had honed her presence into something sharper, observant, restrained, infinitely watchful. She had arrived with none of the extravagance that might shield her from scrutiny. She had chosen instead to be visible in a way that invited judgment. Already, murmurs rippled through the room, subtle yet precise. Comments about her age, her widowhood, her unmarried state now carved into whispered admonitions as if invisibility were her only appropriate garment. She should have retired to the shadows, a voice hissed, as two young debutantes tittered behind fans embroidered with gold thread. A widow of such years, daring to attend? The remark did not reach her ears directly, though the air itself seemed charged with it. She inhaled slowly, a faint smile ghosting her lips, more in armor than amusement. She had learned that society's cruelty rarely sought to wound openly. It preferred the tender cut of implication, the sharpened point of a laugh that did not meet her gaze. And so she stood, as she always had, with her back straight, hands clasped loosely before her, a vessel of patience and measured poise. The Duke entered the room with a subtle thunder of inevitability. He was younger than many expected, tall, impeccably dressed. His coat brushed to a sheen that caught the light with every step. Eyes dark, observant, unafraid. A man whose charm was weaponized, and whose smile promised both amusement and consequence. The Duke had been the subject of more than a few polite sighs and scandalous glances. It was said he could elevate a room with a single quip or flatten it with an arch of an eyebrow. Tonight, as he moved among the crowd, hands clasping gloves and tilting cups of champagne with deliberate grace, the whispers shifted, bending toward him like reeds to wind. His attention, inevitably, alighted on her. Not as one might notice a distant painting, but as one might fix upon a mirror, reflecting both desire and mischief. He approached with the air of a man accustomed to dominion, a predilection for jest, yet unaware that the game might already be slipping beyond his control. There was a brief pause, the hush that precedes something unnoticed until it is too late, as if the entire room collectively inhaled. Her eyes met his with calm defiance, a faint challenge that he neither expected nor understood immediately. He inclined his head, and she inclined hers in return, a silent acknowledgment of shared space, of unspoken understanding. The music swelled, and yet for a heartbeat, the room contracted, time measured in the glances exchanged between them. And then, as was his habit, the Duke allowed a chuckle to escape, low and deliberate, a sound meant to charm and disarm simultaneously. "A widow at 40, he said, his voice carrying just enough for her to hear, yet not enough for the room to detect immediacy. One would think such an age a sufficient excuse to remain unseen at a gathering of youth and fortune. She did not flinch. Her fingers, delicate and deliberate, adjusted a fold of her gown. "And yet, here I am," she replied softly, her voice steady, controlled, with a clarity that made the Duke's words seem fragile, inconsequential. The room's hum seemed to bend, as though his jest had struck against steel and not flesh. He laughed, lightly, a sound meant to echo confidence, yet beneath it, a twitch of surprise betrayed the subtle wound to his pride. Society, however, was quick to seize upon the moment, misreading restraint for embarrassment, composure for submission. Eyes darted, whispers multiplied. She had not faltered, and thus had created the tension every social predator feared. A woman unmoved by spectacle, uninterested in flattery, a mind quietly intact behind her serene mask. The Duke, never accustomed to being met with such equanimity, stepped closer, the faint scent of his cologne, sandalwood and leather, drifting toward her. "And you bear it well," he murmured, almost under his breath, a note of challenge lacing his words. "I wonder if you truly are so indifferent, or if the jest hides your own cunning." Her lips curved into a small, deliberate smile, faint as moonlight across water. "Indifference is a luxury," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Cunning, however, is survival. Perhaps you have yet to learn which is which." The words, innocuous as they seemed, struck like a quietly falling bell in the Duke's mind. The crowd had not yet caught the exchange, but he sensed the shift, the subtle alteration of power in a room usually dominated by his humor and charm. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgment that what had begun as amusement was no longer simple. And for the first time, he realized that jest alone might not save him from consequence. A faint clatter of silver against china drew their eyes briefly to a passing footman, but the pause only amplified the silence that had settled between them. Around them, the orchestra swelled, the chandeliers trembled with reflected light. Every whisper, every rustle of silk seemed to echo the growing tension, as though the room itself had taken notice. The widow, composed, graceful, remained anchored in her dignity, while the Duke, smiling yet alert, recognized that the rules of engagement had shifted. In that suspended moment, the air tasted of expectation, of possibility mingled with threat. The widow, aware of every observer, yet unbowed, held a quiet power that the Duke had not anticipated. And somewhere deep within him, a flicker of unease, half admiration, half apprehension, stirred, signaling that this night, which had begun as ordinary, might yield consequences far beyond amusement. He inclined his head once more, this time with careful deliberation, a silent acknowledgment that the game had begun. She returned the gesture, serene yet precise, her gaze never wavering. And then, as if cued by an invisible hand, the Duke allowed a single phrase to slip into the charged hush, intended lightly, yet laden with risk. "Perhaps, madam, it is not too late to entertain a proposal, even in jest." The words lingered, suspended between audacity and inevitability, and the widow's lips parted in a smile that neither laughed nor recoiled. The ballroom exhaled without knowing it, the spectators' curiosity now a palpable force, drawn magnetically toward her. In that instant, a subtle shift had occurred. What began as jest now threatened to ensnare them both. The following morning arrived cloaked in a pale, hesitant light, the kind that trembles across the London streets before the sun dares to assert itself. Rain had fallen in discreet sheets overnight, leaving cobblestones slick and glistening, reflections of gas lamps trembling in puddles like tiny, uneasy stars. She had awoken with the memory of last night's murmurs still lodged in her chest, a mixture of irritation and quiet triumph that she alone understood. The ballroom, with its laughter and applause, seemed a distant dream, already tinged with the sharp edges of speculation. And yet, beneath the quietude of her rooms, a ripple of expectation had begun to take shape, subtle and insistent, as if the city itself anticipated the events yet to unfold. Her gaze lingered upon the window, the cool droplets drawing rivulets along the glass, distorting the pale light. She dressed with careful deliberation, each movement a choreography of restraint and elegance, her fingers brushing lace and satin as if to remind herself that dignity was an armor stronger than silk. She thought of the Duke, the echo of his jest still teasing the corners of her mind, an unbidden smile forming despite the propriety she so fiercely maintained. That he had dared speak thus, half mockery, half challenge, left a peculiar thrill lodged beneath the skin of her composure. She knew the room had not heard the full measure of their exchange, and in that knowledge lay a small, delicious victory. It was a light tap upon her door that announced the first token of intrigue. A footman, a slender, nervous youth, bearing a small, delicately wrapped package. She accepted it with a measured nod, her hand steady, her expression unshaken, and only when the door closed behind him did she dare to inspect the gift. A bouquet lay within, roses white and pink, arranged with an artistry that suggested both intention and taste. No note accompanied them, yet the air seemed to carry a message, invisible yet unmistakable. He had thought of her after the ballroom, and something within that consideration unsettled her. The flowers were a token of amusement, of attention, yet they carried an unspoken weight, a herald of what the society around them would soon amplify. By noon, the first ripples of rumor had begun their circuit, subtle as a whispered breath yet no less pervasive. The servant spoke of the Duke's jest with measured curiosity. By evening, it had filtered into drawing rooms, salons, and the corners of tea tables where genteel women gathered to sip quietly and dissect the lives of others. The widow, aware of each syllable passed in hushed tones, felt a strange duality of power and vulnerability, knowing she could neither erase the tale nor entirely shape its course. When the Duke arrived at her residence that afternoon, it was with the precision of a man aware that propriety demanded both restraint and flair. His coat was impeccable, his gloves pressed to a near ritualistic standard, his gaze controlled yet curious, assessing not the room but her. He offered no overt apology for the jest, for it required none. Instead, he carried himself with the arrogance of one who knows a trap has been set, though he is not yet certain who will fall within it. She received him in the drawing-room, the fire casting elongated shadows that danced across her composed figure, her expression serene yet unreadable. He bowed lightly, the faintest smirk playing upon his lips. "I trust the morning found you in tolerable spirits," he said, each word deliberate, polished, and calibrated to unsettle and intrigue. She inclined her head, acknowledging him with a civility that did not extend to flattery. "The morning serves as it must," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of experience, a subtle reminder that she had endured far more than a single jest from a powerful man. The conversation flowed, careful and measured, yet beneath each syllable, a current of tension ran deep. He spoke of trivialities, the weather, the city's recent intrigues, yet every gesture, every glance, seemed to probe the edges of propriety, to test the boundaries of her patience. She returned each inquiry with restraint, offering enough engagement to maintain decorum, yet withholding the intimacy that would allow him mastery over her. The Duke, accustomed to obedience, found this subtle defiance both vexing and captivating. It was a game he had not expected to be so dangerous, for it challenged his assumptions and demanded a new form of tact he had seldom practiced. By evening, society's scrutiny had escalated into scandal. The local newspapers, ever hungry for morsels of intrigue, hinted at the ballroom's incident with careful ambiguity. Headlines suggested, without stating outright, that a most improper attachment had begun to stir between a celebrated nobleman and a widow of 40 years. Drawing rooms and parlors buzzed with anticipation and censure, each lady recalibrating her judgment of both participants, each gentleman assessing the potential shift in social alliances. The widow, ever vigilant, felt the weight of their gaze, yet bore it with a measured grace that hinted at knowledge, patience, and the quiet delight of agency in a world that sought to erase her presence. That night, a second token arrived, a small, leather-bound book of poetry, carefully inscribed with words meant to provoke, to charm, to unsettle. She recognized the hand without opening it, deliberate, elegant, insistent. The message, though veiled in literary courtesy, was clear. The Duke was aware of the effect his jest had wrought, and he intended to pursue the consequences he had initiated. She ran her fingers along the spine, a shiver of anticipation and wariness mingling in her chest. Here was a man who believed he played the master, yet she understood, with a faint thrill, that the game might be far more intricate than he imagined. Even as she read the first lines, society's whispers pressed upon her, the scandal spreading like ink in water. Friends and acquaintances offered feigned indifference, their eyes bright with curiosity, while those less forgiving drew subtle boundaries, their polite avoidance a silent condemnation. She felt the duality of their attention acutely, exposed yet visible, judged yet commanding notice. The tokens, each a gesture of interest, had become instruments of both amusement and danger, a tangled net in which the rules of decorum and desire intertwined, leaving her both intrigued and wary. Late into the night, she found herself at a window, gazing at the city bathed in gaslight, reflections trembling in the rain-slicked streets below. The Duke's presence, though absent physically, weighed upon her thoughts with an insistence she could not dismiss. His jest had become a challenge, his attention a perilous gift, and society's judgment the constant hum of expectation pressing against her. The flowers, the book, the whispered rumors, all converged to form a quiet storm, one that promised upheaval, revelation, and a confrontation she had not anticipated but could not escape. And as the candlelight flickered against her walls, casting shadows that danced like courtly observers, she felt a delicate thrill of anticipation. The Duke's jest had ensnared them both, and the world would soon be forced to watch the consequences unfold. In the soft hush of her chamber, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile, aware that the next move would not be dictated by society, nor by jest, but by choice, courage, unyielding mastery over the expectations that sought to define her. The first token had arrived. The drawing-room was drenched in the dim, honeyed glow of late afternoon, the fire casting flickering patterns across Persian rugs and gilded frames, while rain streaked softly against the tall windows. Outside, London wept in silvery sheets, each droplet a whispered drumbeat against the roof, a muted echo of the tension that had settled between them. The widow sat upright in her favorite armchair, the curve of her shoulders relaxed yet vigilant, fingers intertwined with quiet precision. She wore a gown of deep emerald, its fabric catching the firelight in subtle waves, reflecting the quiet turbulence in her chest. The room, though orderly and tranquil, seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that the game of jest and scandal had now entered a realm far more perilous: intimacy. He entered with measured steps, the faint scent of sandalwood trailing behind him, the Duke's presence filling the chamber with the inevitability of consequence. His coat, impeccably tailored, brushed against the edges of the rug, the gloves in his hand pressed in a gesture both casual and deliberate. He paused a fraction too long at the threshold, assessing her posture, the calm intelligence in her gaze, the slight tightening at the corner of her mouth that hinted at amusement, or perhaps challenge. A man accustomed to obedience found himself unsettled by subtlety, and for the first time, the Duke sensed a dissonance he could neither command nor dismiss. "Madam," he said, his voice low, resonant, careful not to fracture the fragile tension of the room. "I trust you will forgive my intrusion. I find myself compelled to speak in a manner more private, more truthful than that which society permits." She inclined her head slightly, an acknowledgment without invitation. Her lips curved faintly in a smile that suggested patience, endurance, and the quiet awareness of power. "Truth," she said softly, "is a luxury often reserved for those unwilling to endure observation. Speak, if it must be so, but know that every word will be measured." He approached the hearth, standing where the firelight caught the angles of his face, illuminating eyes that were sharp, restless, and unexpectedly vulnerable. "I jested," he began carefully, "at the ballroom last night. I intended—" He paused, the words faltering as he realized intention alone could not erase consequence. "I intended amusement. Nothing more. And yet, your response, your composure, it has undone me far more than any jest could achieve." Her eyes softened fractionally, a motion almost imperceptible, a concession that recognition of vulnerability could be acknowledged without surrender. "You presume," she said, measured, "that composure undoes men. Yet often, it merely reveals their ignorance." She leaned back slightly, the firelight tracing the curve of her cheek, highlighting both serenity and the imperceptible tension coiled beneath. "I answered only because I am neither invisible nor irrelevant. Your jest required acknowledgment, and I am not one to vanish when attention seeks to define me falsely." The Duke's gaze sharpened, the usual bravado faltering beneath the precision of her words. A flicker of admiration, mingled with the unease of discovery, crossed his features. "So," he murmured, stepping closer, "you admit the trap was mine, yet you entered willingly?" His tone was incredulous, a mix of challenge and disbelief, as though the concept of a woman outmaneuvering him in subtlety were both insulting and intoxicating. She met his gaze with unwavering steadiness, the faintest arch of an eyebrow her only concession to humor. "I do not enter traps," she said quietly. "I traverse them, aware of their edges and the forces that seek to contain me." "You jested." I responded. "The world may see folly, but we, those who endure, perceive only survival." He paced a slow arc, the room echoing faintly with the soft click of polished boots against the rug. His hands flexed, then relaxed, then folded loosely behind his back. "You are unlike any woman I have known," he admitted, his voice lower now, intimate yet tinged with revelation. "And I, who pride myself upon subtlety, find myself unprepared for your transparency. You have turned jest into reflection, amusement into challenge, and in doing so, rendered me helpless." She allowed a pause, the faint sound of rain punctuating the space between them. "Helplessness," she said gently, "is an awakening, not a weakness. It is the moment one recognizes limits, and chooses to act with clarity rather than fear." Her words, carefully chosen, seemed to settle around them like a mantle of gravity, shifting the balance of power with quiet inevitability. For the first time, he felt the disquiet of admiration tempered by awareness. Every calculation he had relied upon, every assumption of charm, jest, or audacity, crumbled beneath the precision of her intelligence. And yet, in that realization, a strange exhilaration unfurled, a recognition that the challenge offered was worth the peril. "Then," he said slowly, almost reverently, "if I am undone, it is by merit, not misfortune. Yet, I confess, I find myself unaccustomed to being undone." She inclined her head, a faint smile touching the corners of her lips. "Few are prepared for what is genuine," she said softly, "and fewer still appreciate the discomfort it brings. You may find that, should this continue, you are no longer the orchestrator of jest, but a participant in consequences far more profound." He closed the space between them, the firelight casting long shadows that intertwined like dancers caught mid-motion. "Consequences," he murmured, voice hushed, deliberate, "I have long understood to be inevitable. Yet never have I encountered one so compelling." His hand hovered briefly near the edge of her chair, an unspoken offer, a gesture of both restraint and invitation. She did not flinch. She simply regarded him with the clarity of someone who had survived far more than a single night's jest, someone who could assess intention without panic, who could measure desire without surrender. The room seemed suspended, every detail magnified, the glint of gold on the mantel, the soft murmur of rain, the subtle scent of sandalwood mingling with the faint perfume she wore. In this quiet crucible, the veneer of public scrutiny fell away, leaving only two individuals, each aware of the other's cunning, courage, and unspoken needs. And though neither spoke the word aloud, both understood the stakes had changed. What began as a jest had transformed into an encounter of revelation, a turning point that would reshape the unspoken contract between them. Finally he exhaled, a sound both deliberate and weary, acknowledging the shift. "If this engagement, for want of a better term, is to continue, then it will not remain a jest," he said, his voice low, reverent, and impossible to ignore. She inclined her head slowly, letting the words settle, recognizing both their truth and their danger. And as the rain traced silver paths down the windowpane, their eyes met in the firelight, and the air trembled with unspoken possibility. The Duke's smile, faint, restrained, acknowledged defeat and fascination in equal measure. The widow's expression remained serene, a study in composure, yet her heart fluttered with the exquisite thrill of agency reclaimed, the dangerous pleasure of recognition without surrender. Outside, the city continued its indifferent pulse, but inside that quiet chamber, a subtle revolution had occurred. The jest was no longer his alone, and the delicate, perilous intimacy between them had begun. The morning of the assembly arrived with an almost conspiratorial clarity. The sky, a pale wash of gray and gold, seemed to lean close to the city, as if it too wished to witness the unfolding. The widow prepared herself in the privacy of her chamber. The air scented faintly with lavender and the lingering trace of rose from the bouquet that had arrived days prior. Her gown, a deep sapphire of silk and lace, embraced her form with a quiet dignity she had cultivated over years of solitude. Every fold, every stitch, spoke not of extravagance, but of unyielding self-possession. She moved with deliberation, each motion a dialogue with the expectations of society, every gesture a declaration that she would not be diminished by whispers or jest. The Duke arrived precisely at the appointed hour, the metallic echo of his boots on the stone corridor announcing him before he appeared. His countenance was composed, yet in his eyes lay a fire that no decorum could suppress, a blend of admiration, fear, and recognition of the perilous delight he had courted for weeks. He carried no flowers this time, no tokens of jest. The day itself was his statement, and the choice to appear beside her a bold gesture in a world quick to judge. As he entered, the widow's gaze met his, steady and unflinching, and in that silent exchange, all the artifice of prior encounters fell away. They moved toward the assembly hall together, their steps measured yet resolute. The room itself seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, the chandeliers casting light in perfect, trembling prisms, the polished floors reflecting 1,000 glances. Society had gathered in expectation, the hum of gossip and polite curiosity forming a low, insistent thrum that pressed against every wall. Heads turned, eyes widened, whispers darted like sparks along the gathered crowd. She felt each glance as acutely as a blade, yet her posture did not falter, her gaze neither invited nor shrank. The Duke, beside her, seemed equally aware of the scrutiny, yet walked with the composure of a man claiming both the stage and the consequence he had previously skirted. When they reached the center, the hush deepened. Ladies curtsied subtly, gentlemen adjusted waistcoats and posture, and the orchestra, sensing a tension beyond its music, softened into the tentative resonance of strings and woodwinds. The Duke took a single step forward, drawing a breath that held both reverence and certainty. His voice, low yet penetrating, carried across the room, steady enough to command attention yet infused with an intimacy that unsettled every expectation. "I spoke in jest once," he began, his gaze never leaving hers, "believing that amusement could mask indifference, that society could contain both propriety and desire. Yet your response, measured, composed, unyielding, has revealed truths that no jest could obscure. I offered mockery. You met it with courage. I offered control. You returned autonomy. And in doing so, you have undone not only my amusement, but my certainty, my pride, and perhaps my very reason to withhold what I ought to have offered honestly." A murmur passed through the assembly, but it was drowned beneath the weight of the words themselves. She met his eyes, unwavering, the subtle arch of her brow both challenge and invitation. "Words," she said softly, "carry meaning only when paired with action. I have survived ridicule, whispered judgment, and expectation. I have learned to see beneath jest, to measure intention, and to claim what is rightfully mine, even when the world attempts to dictate otherwise." The Duke stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking to a breadth defined by breath and heartbeats. "Then know this," he said, his voice hushed yet resolute, "that I will neither retract nor jest further. If I have offered audacity, I now offer sincerity. If I have challenged, I now submit, not to the world, but to the truth I see before me, that your courage, your composure, and your intellect are worth more than the opinions of every idle observer." A flicker of surprise crossed her features, almost imperceptible, a subtle acknowledgment that the gravity of his declaration had not been anticipated, yet was fully recognized. Her lips curved faintly, the merest hint of warmth, and she inclined her head with the quiet authority of one who has endured storms and remains unbowed. "Truth," she murmured, "is indeed rare and courage rarer still. That you acknowledge both does not compel me to acquiesce, but it does command my attention." The assembly watched, riveted, the tension a tangible force pressing against the walls. Society, which had once sought to define her by jest, age, and widowhood, now faced an unanticipated spectacle, a man of power declaring earnest admiration and intent before the eyes of all. Whispers began, tentative at first, then gathering audacity. "A jest become genuine," one lady breathed. "The Duke entangled in his own folly," a gentleman muttered. Yet the widow remained composed, her gaze anchored to the man who had both challenged and captivated her, neither inviting pity nor yielding to pride. The Duke extended a hand, deliberate, steady, a gesture both formal and intimate. "If you will permit," he said, "I ask not as a jest, nor as a concession to society, but as a choice freely given. Will you walk forward with me, not in amusement, but in truth?" Her fingers hovered over his, hesitation only a whisper, a fleeting recognition of the gravity, the danger, and the audacity of the moment. "I will," she said finally, her voice steady yet carrying the undercurrent of emotion that defied society's expectations. "Not because of jest, nor for approval, but because choice itself has worth beyond their judgment." A subtle murmur of approval passed through the room, tempered by disbelief. The Duke's eyes, dark and fathomless, softened, and he bowed slightly, the faintest flicker of a smile breaking the stoic lines of his features. Their hands met fully, a gesture simple yet electric, signaling the shift from public spectacle to intimate commitment. Every whisper, every glance, every shadowed judgment could not undo the decision made in firelight, reflection, and quiet determination. Yet even as the tension resolved in shared acknowledgment, a subtle awareness lingered. The storm of society's scrutiny had not abated. There remained those who would not forgive, who would twist jest into scandal anew, and who would test both courage and composure in days yet to come. The declaration was made, the resolution chosen, yet the path forward remained treacherous, a delicate balance of honor, perception, and unspoken desire. As the assembly slowly dispersed, the widow and the Duke remained at the center, hands lightly entwined, gazes locked, the firelight catching in their eyes like twin stars reflecting an unspoken promise. The orchestra resumed, soft strains of music filling the vast space, yet neither noticed. Outside, the city carried on, indifferent to the quiet revolution that had occurred within one room, yet the air between them hummed with the potential of what might yet come. And as they turned to leave together, the widow allowed herself the faintest smile, one that acknowledged both triumph and uncertainty, for she knew that while the declaration had been made, the dance between jest, choice, and consequence was far from over. The Duke, equally aware, each breath deliberate, for the world could watch, judge, and speculate, but within the fragile intimacy they shared, a new game had begun, one that neither jest nor society could contain. The morning of the union broke with a fragile brilliance, as if the heavens themselves had paused to witness the culmination of weeks long in design and dread. Pale sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the chapel, fracturing across the polished oak floors and gilded pews, illuminating the intricate patterns of lace and embroidery on the gowns that glimmered like dew upon a meadow. Outside, the streets of London carried the usual bustle, oblivious to the delicate storm of judgment and admiration that had gathered inside these walls. Every breath seemed charged, every heartbeat measured against the gentle tolling of the bells, each note vibrating in the chest as if echoing the collective anticipation of a society eager for spectacle, yet unprepared for sincerity. She entered first, poised upon the threshold with the grace of one accustomed to being seen yet refusing to be diminished. Her gown, of soft cerulean silk embroidered with silver thread, flowed like liquid sky across the stone floor, catching the light in subtle waves. Each step was measured, deliberate, a silent dialogue with every eye that dared to linger. She did not falter, nor did she offer herself for approval. Instead, she walked with the quiet authority of one who had survived gossip, ridicule, and the precarious judgments of age and widowhood, and emerged unbowed. The Duke, standing near the altar, felt the air shift as she approached. He had long since abandoned jest. No trace of amusement softened the edges of his gaze. It was steady, intense, and infinitely vulnerable in ways he had never permitted himself to feel publicly. The lines of his coat and the polished shine of his boots spoke of power, of wealth, of inherited expectation. But beneath it all, there was a tremor of awe, a recognition that this moment required surrender not to decorum, but to truth. He stepped forward slightly, offering his hand, the smallest of gestures charged with gravity and intent. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the hall fell silent in deference to the unspoken covenant between them. Society's whispers, poised at the edge of audibility, faltered. The orchestra's tentative strain seemed suddenly unnecessary, a mere echo of the music that played between two people who had endured storms, subtle battles, and the labyrinthine games of propriety and expectation. The Duke's hand, warm and steady, brushed against hers as she accepted it, a signal that the jest, the scandal, and the private confessions had all led to this singular truth. Choice freely made, courage recognized, love confessed. He drew a breath, steady and measured, and spoke in a voice both intimate and commanding. I once offered jest where earnest should have prevailed. I once believed the world's opinion a shield sufficient to dictate action. Yet in your courage, your dignity, your composure, I have found the measure of my own folly. No laughter can redeem what truth demands. No jest can erase the awareness of what I have discovered, that my admiration, my intent, and my heart belong wholly to you. She listened, unflinching, yet her chest swelled imperceptibly with the recognition of sincerity. And I, she said, her voice soft yet resolute, have long endured the judgments of those who would see me invisible, diminished, or erased. You have revealed that courage is not only endurance, but a shared recognition, a dialogue of respect and attention. That you acknowledge this, that you choose this truth over all else, does not compel me to acceptance, yet it makes refusal impossible. The clergyman's voice, a gentle intonation of ceremonial phrasing, began the formalities of union, yet it could not drown the electricity that had taken residence between them. Every word of ritual was punctuated by the subtle tremor of awareness, the knowledge that society, with all its rules and scrutiny, could not dictate the alignment of hearts so fiercely claimed. Their hands remained entwined, fingers interlacing with a quiet certainty, the slight pressure of connection and affirmation of commitment, courage, and mutual recognition. A hush fell upon the congregation, and the Duke, sensing the moment's zenith, allowed a smile to touch the corner of his mouth. Half relief, half reverence. "You have bested me," he murmured quietly, a confession meant only for her. "Not by jest, nor by accident, but by the integrity of your being. I am undone, and yet, in that undoing, made whole. Her lips curved faintly, a smile both tender and imperious. "And you," she whispered in response, "have learned that power does not reside in spectacle, nor in jest, but in choice, courage, and respect. You have chosen wisely, for once." The ceremony progressed with measured dignity, the vows exchanged not as the echo of social expectation, but as declarations of profound understanding. Each syllable carried weight, each pause resonated with the shared history of scandal, confession, and mutual recognition. The Duke's voice, at once commanding and intimate, wove seamlessly with hers, a tapestry of acknowledgement and devotion. Society, accustomed to superficial gestures, found itself unprepared for authenticity rendered with such quiet authority. When the final affirmation passed between them, a gentle murmur of approval rose, yet it was tempered by disbelief. A woman long dismissed, a widow of 40, had commanded attention, respect, and union, not through compliance, but through unwavering grace and intellect. The Duke squeezed her hand gently, a silent promise that the journey had only begun, yet that together they would navigate the perils of observation, expectation, and desire. Outside, the gas lamps reflected in wet streets, a city oblivious to the quiet triumph within the chapel. Yet within those walls, two hearts had aligned in defiance of the gossip, the jest, and the scrutiny of a world unwilling to see women as autonomous, capable beings. Each glance between them, each subtle gesture, spoke of battles endured, of courage reclaimed, and of love forged not in ease, but in the furnace of challenge and respect. As they left the chapel, hands still lightly entwined, the widow allowed herself a final glance over her shoulder, toward the faces of those who had whispered, judged, and doubted. She met gaze after gaze with serene defiance, and a faint, triumphant smile hinted at the knowledge that scandal had transformed into acknowledgement, that ridicule had given way to reverence, and that dignity, once claimed, could never again be taken. The Duke, sensing both her triumph and her vigilance, tightened his hand around hers subtly, a silent agreement that the battles ahead, social scrutiny, whispered doubt, and the ever-watchful eyes of London, would be faced together. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture of deference, respect, and unspoken devotion, acknowledging that the jest which had begun this entanglement had led not to embarrassment, but to revelation, not to folly, but to the promise of shared power and affection. In the stillness of that moment, as candlelight flickered against walls of carved oak and polished marble, both understood that the story which had begun in jest, scandal, and observation had reached its first peak, but that the resonance of choice, courage, and truth would echo far beyond the chapel doors. Love had been claimed not as a spectacle, nor as a submission to expectation, but as a deliberate, unyielding declaration, one that would endure long after the murmurs of society faded into the clattering rhythm of everyday life. And as they stepped into the carriage that awaited, the streets reflecting the soft light of dawn, the widow allowed herself a final private smile, knowing that though the jest had led them to scandal, and scandal to confession, it was now courage, truth, and mutual recognition that would guide the journey ahead. The Duke, seated beside her, caught the subtle curl of her lips, and for the first time, fully understood that the most powerful unions are forged not by circumstance, wealth, or whimsy, but by the deliberate choice to honor, respect, and protect one another in a world often unwilling to witness such authenticity. And in that quiet, shared understanding, the story paused on the precipice of the future, triumphant, tender, and infinitely uncertain, for love had been claimed, yet the delicate dance of society, desire, and consequence had only just begun.